I shall wait until it comes up. So our reading today is taken from John chapter 6, beginning to read at verse 1. So it's Jesus feeds the 5,000. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him, because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up, "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing what they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks
be to God. Lovely, thank you. And then Martin, if you could enable me to share my screen.
You should be able to. You should have the option share screen at the bottom.
Oh, hang on. Thank you, Sheila, for reading that. And I just wanted to just say a few words, if I can, about this very well-known parable, this very well-known story, rather, this miracle. In fact, it is the only miracle that occurs in all 4 Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This is the only miracle that occurs in all 4, the feeding of the 5,000. Now, I'm sure if it happened nowadays, there would be all kinds of issues about it, and some people would be worried about health and safety or whatever, of sharing a picnic. But nevertheless, it is a hugely well-known story, and I'd just like to draw 1 or 2 issues and messages out. First of all, what kind of miracle was it? Clearly, there were hardly anybody had any food, it seemed to be saying, and therefore they needed some food. So many people see that the miracle is the miraculous multiplication of food out of thin air. And before, there was nothing, but Jesus, by his miraculous power, was able to produce food. That is one understanding of what the miracle was at the feeding of the 5,000. For other people, that's not the miracle at all. The miracle is the change in people's response. In other words, they saw this young boy coming forward with his packed lunch, and this view would put it that they were so moved by his selfless generosity that they overcame their own natural inclinations to be selfish, and they shared their packed lunch too. So it wasn't the miraculous multiplication of packed lunches, but it was the miraculous change in people's hearts to be generous. Now, personally, I'm not too bothered which way around you want to argue it, what kind of miracle it was, but nevertheless, something definitely unusual happened there. And of course, for a good Jewish people, they would immediately see that this had a resonance from the Old Testament. Providing bread in a remote place was just like God did, providing manna in the wilderness. And so perhaps they began to say, oh, well, perhaps Jesus is somebody very special. It has echoes and resonances of what happened in the past. And therefore, that is why it was so significant. Now, there's lots I could draw out of this story, but I just want to draw out a couple of things, if I may. First of all, it's Jesus himself who draws attention to the perceived problem. Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? And in John's Gospel, it's presented as a bit of a test to the disciples. Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat? Now, clearly, one response could be, well, it's not our problem, is it? They're all adults here. They've all come out into this remote place. And perhaps it's their fault they haven't got any food. If they haven't got any food, they must have forgotten. Why are we responsible for other people's thoughtlessness? You know, they should have been good Boy Scouts and be prepared and come, you know, all sorted. And they should have really thought about it beforehand. So perhaps one reaction would be, well, it's their fault. It's not our problem. So why should we get involved? And Philip's answer just draws attention to the scale of the problem. 6 months' wages would not be enough to provide a pat lunch for everybody. I don't know which catering firm he got the quotation from, but nevertheless, you've got the idea of how many people were there. People say 5,000 men plus women and children, and probably none of those were on a diet. So they all had a good, healthy appetite. So clearly lots of food was needed, and 6 months' wages wouldn't be enough. So clearly we don't have the resources to meet this huge problem that's been presented to us or pointed out to us by Jesus. And he clearly doesn't seem to accept the fact that it's their problem and they can sort it out. He wants to provide for them, which is an indication surely of Jesus's love, his concern for people who through no fault of their own, or perhaps through a fault of their own, are in problems and issues. And of course, Andrew says, well, you know, there's a boy here and he's got something, so he perhaps, you know, pointed out, but I mean, it's not much, is it? The fish would have been the size of sardines. It was a couple of sardine sandwiches, basically, what it is. And of course, he's quite right, he says, there's a boy here who's got a pat lunch, but how far will they, the 5 loaves and 2 fish, go among so many? And that is the phrase perhaps I'd like to concentrate on this evening. How far will they go among so many? The need is great and the resources seem so thin, so meager. And so we've established a principle that a very little goes a long way when it is given over to Jesus, because as we know, Jesus stands, he blesses the bread and breaks it, and they distribute it, and it says that everybody ate their fill. The actual word used is quite a farming-like word. It's usually used of animals eating. They ate their fill. In other words, they didn't hold back. They had a certainly good feast, and even having eaten their fill, there was still 12 baskets of leftovers. So it's a bit like turning water into wine. There was loads left over. Jesus seemed to provide more than enough. I don't know whether you've ever been to one of these sort of parties where it's a bit embarrassing. They sort of ask people to hold back a minute because we don't want everybody at the front of the queue to eat all the food. So people at the back of the queue, there'll be none left. You know, there's no quiches or sausage rolls left. Everyone's gone. You see all the people walking away, don't you, with their plates, and they've got all piled up with food. And I'm wondering, is there going to be anything left for me? You know, because I've got a healthy appetite. But clearly there wasn't a problem like that with the feeding of the 5,000 with Jesus. And perhaps there is something here for us at Holy Trinity. We all feel the loss of Michael and Alison. We discovered at the APCM from the Archdeacon, I'll get her title right this time, the Archdeacon, who seemed to suggest that it could be up to a year next autumn before we know precisely what's happening. And perhaps we're beginning to think, well, how will we manage? How are we going to cope and do everything in church and run a service and the parish and the school and the hall roof? Well, we've already had an answer to prayer that already. And there is, how will we manage? We might also be thinking about that personally, as well as obviously as a church. You know, COVID, with the restrictions that it's imposed on us in our second lockdown for another week or so yet, and we're not quite sure what's going to be happening at Christmas. And then if we do have a loosened up Christmas, are they then going to lock us down again in the new year? We're going to have a miserable new year to pay for seeing everybody at Christmas. How are we going to manage? What resources do we have when there seems to be such a need out there? So I think some of the principles I drew out from this little story is we recognize the little that we have. None of us, I don't think, feel as though we've got everything, we know everything, we've got it all together, it's all planned, don't worry. We feel like we've got 5 fish sandwiches and there's a need of a huge crowd of people. But the encouragement seems to be that if we, both personally and as a fellowship, as a church, give what we need to do to Jesus, then I think things are going to look a lot brighter. I wonder who the crowd are facing us who are in need. That's Jesus is pointing to, and that is something I just want to just finish off with here. Where is the need? With the disciples, it was obvious there were 5,000 hungry people standing in front of them. Clearly, we have a need within our own fellowship here at Holy Trinity, within the church, the wider church members who perhaps can't join us this evening on Zoom because they don't have the facilities they have. Other people who are peripheral to the congregation and they're on the edges and margins of things, the needs that they have, and indeed lots of other people in the community. Where is the need? I think there's a lot of hidden need, and people have often mentioned about mental health issues, etc. at this time. What are our resources? Well, humanly speaking, very little. We don't have a lot of money in the bank by the sounds of things. We've had enough in the past. We're not quite sure what's happening in the future. We don't have any full-time paid staff at all. So if we're talking about church and the they are us. And David Watson used to say, if you want a loving church, give your love. Why aren't they doing something in church? Well, they are us, because it's thee and me, which is Holy Trinity. There's nobody else to do it. There is no paid professional to help us out. We have to look to each other, and we have to look to the person of Jesus. And I'm sure we will be surprised that our meager resources, the five loaves and the 2 fish, actually can go a lot further than we think. We might actually find hidden resources amongst many of us who we didn't know, that we didn't think we had. People who have previously been on the edge might step up and step forward and say, yeah, well, I can look after this and I can do that, because I would like a little bit of life in church, so I'll give my bit of life. I would like a bit of vitality, and I would like to give that as well. And so what can we do? And it's a wonderful, if you like, story of Jesus providing for these people, perhaps quite unexpectedly, but yet in such a wonderful way. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, and because I think I'd like to see everybody and talk a little bit about what they might think